My name's Stacie Dooley, and I am going to share with you something that I learned from last week's study in the Chronological book, Chronological Bible. As I was kind of reading back over it, Ezekiel 23 really stuck out to me. It was the parable of adultery, and this section is very rated R. And I don't watch rated R movies, but I was quite shocked at the things that I read here. So it was very interesting. But it talks about, God tells Ezekiel this parable, and it's about two prostitutes. And Aholah represents Samaria, and Aholibah represents Jerusalem. So the prostitutes are sisters, and one of them goes out and just runs wild and prostitutes herself and chases after men. And it says that it began when she was young. And then in verse 9 it says, "Therefore I handed her over to her lovers, the Assyrians, for whom she lusted." Well, what did they do to her? In verse 10, they stripped her naked, took away her sons and daughters, and killed her with the sword. She became a byword among women, and punishment was inflicted on her. So basically this says that she was killed. I mean, she committed these sins, and then she was murdered for her sin. And not only that, it wasn't just she was murdered and then forgotten, but she became a byword among women. People were talking about this. I mean, her name was known. It was known that she was a prostitute. It was known that she did these things, and then she was murdered for it. Well, then I was quite shocked to read in verse 11 that her sister, Aholibah, saw this. So right there I stopped and said, oh, well, good. She saw this, what had happened to her sister, and she ran the other direction. You know, up until this point she was a prostitute. But then she changed her ways because she didn't want to end up dead like her sister. Well, that's not at all what happened. Her sister Aholibah, in verse 11, saw this with her own eyes. She saw what happened to her sister. Yet, in her lust and prostitution, she was more depraved than her sister. She too lusted after the Assyrians. And it goes on in verse 14 to say, she carried her prostitution further, still further. She saw men portrayed on a wall, figures of Chaldeans, portrayed in red, with belts around their waist and flowing turbans on their heads. All of them look like Babylonian chariot officers, natives of Chaldea. And then in verse 16, as soon as she saw them, she lusted after them and sent messengers to them in Chaldea. And it goes on to talk about, you know, how good looking these men were and how strong and powerful. And isn't that just how sin is? You know, it says that she saw these men and how they were portrayed. And sin portrays itself as enticing and good. I just think back to the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and how Eve saw that the fruit was good to eat. You know, she used her eyes and she decided in her mind, well, this looks good, so it must be good. Well, that's what's going on here, is she saw these men and they looked good and she wanted them and she gave herself to them. And I was so shocked that she witnessed her own sister's sin, you know, saw the death that her sister suffered. I mean, her sister died for this sin, yet she didn't learn from it. She just followed right in her sister's footsteps. I was absolutely shocked by that, but then I realized that, you know, I too have seen the sin of somebody else, especially in God's Word. I mean, you know, Jonah, for example, you know, he ran from God. You know, God told him clearly, go preach against Nineveh, and he ran in the opposite direction. Well, how many times have I done that? You know, God speaks clearly to me, Stacie, you need to do this. You need to share the gospel with that person. And I go, oh, no, I don't want to. And, you know, I've just run from God. And it's so obvious and so easy for me to point the finger at these sisters and go, well, that's just silly. How dare her follow in her footsteps? But I'm convicted in my own life of not learning from, you know, biblical characters, the mistakes that they made, not looking at them and saying, okay, I'm not going to make those same mistakes. It's so easy to focus our eyes on what looks good and trust our own judgment. So this week my prayer is that I just trust the Lord, because He is all-knowing and all-powerful, and I just pray that I would remember my first love and be faithful to my first love. Thanks for listening.